The mountain air was thin, cold, and smelled of sharp pine, but the stench of entitlement arriving at my doorstep was far stronger. Alaric didn't even bother to knock. He simply shouldered the heavy oak door open, dragging two oversized suitcases behind him as if he were checking into a hotel. "We heard you bought a luxury villa in the mountains, so we've come to live with you," he announced, his voice echoing off the stone walls with a hollow, unearned confidence. My daughter, Greer, followed him inside, her eyes already scanning the vaulted ceiling with the cold appraisal of someone looking for a profit. I stood by the fireplace, the iron poker still in my hand, watching the dust motes dance in the intrusive light they had let in. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. I didn't move to help them with their bags, nor did I offer a single word of welcome to break the growing tension. Alaric tossed his expensive coat onto a handmade chair I had spent 3 months restoring, showing a complete lack of respect for the history of this place. They saw the stillness in my posture and the gray in my hair, and they clearly mistook my patience for the slow decline of an old man. Greer began gesturing toward the west wing, already discussing which rooms would serve as her office and their private lounge. It was a fascinating display of greed, performed right in front of the man who had spent 40 years of his life earning this quiet sanctuary. I didn't stop them because I wanted to see exactly how far their arrogance would carry them before they hit the boundary I had set. "The master suite is at the top of the stairs, I assume?" Alaric asked, not even looking back as he began the ascent. I finally set the iron poker down, the sharp metallic clink against the stone being the only warning I intended to provide for now. They thought they were moving into a retirement home they could manage, but they were actually walking into a trap of their own making. Alaric had no idea that the luxury he saw was merely a gilded cage, and I held the only set of keys. Alaric was already struggling with the smart home panel by the kitchen, stabbing at the glass with a frantic finger like a bird pecking at a shiny trap that offered no reward. I watched him from the shadows of the hallway, leaning against the doorframe and enjoying the way his face turned a specific shade of frustrated crimson as he realized the technology was smarter than he was. He likely thinks I don't know how to operate the heating system I designed myself, probably assuming I still communicate via carrier pigeon or smoke signals in this primitive altitude. My wife, Marin, walked past them both without a word, her silence a heavy, physical presence that seemed to drop the room's temperature by 10 degrees without needing a thermostat. Greer was busy rearranging the spice rack, tossing out my jars of dried mountain herbs because they weren't organic or branded enough for her delicate city palate. I've spent 60 years learning that true peace isn't found in a quiet room, but in the absolute absence of noisy fools who mistake volume for authority. "The espresso machine is broken, Hollis," Alaric barked, not looking up from his digital battle with the touchscreen, his voice dripping with unearned impatience. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug that has outlasted 3 of my cars and most of my patience for this generation. "It's not broken, Alaric. It just requires a level of patience and manual dexterity you haven't yet acquired," I replied, my voice as dry as the mountain air in mid-August. I remembered a time when a guest waited to be invited before they started redecorating, but apparently, manners have gone the way of the rotary phone and common sense. There is a specific kind of internal pressure that settles in your chest when you realize your own flesh and blood treats your sanctuary like a conquered territory they intend to exploit. I caught Marin's eye for a fraction of a second, and in that look, we exchanged 1,000 words about the storm we both knew was gathering on the horizon. Alaric eventually gave up on the coffee and started complaining about the Wi-Fi signal, as if the majestic peaks around us owed him high-speed access to his trivial world. I didn't bother telling him that the router was currently unplugged and sitting safely in my back pocket for the sake of a quiet evening. I've discovered that watching someone search frantically for something they'll never find is far more entertaining than any scripted television show money can buy. They believe they are the ones taking control of this mountain villa, but they are merely uninvited actors on a stage I built with my own calloused hands. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, Alaric found the first of the heavy, locked doors in the deep basement. He didn't know that some doors are kept shut not to keep people out, but to keep the truth from escaping before I am ready to tell it. Alaric decided that my study, the sanctuary where I've kept my journals for 30 years, would make an excellent gaming lounge for his weekend retreats. He began sliding my hand-carved oak desk toward the hallway, the heavy wood groaning in protest as it scraped against the marble floor. I watched him from the doorway, accidentally triggering the high-pitched alarm on my new watch while trying to check the time. A minor technical skirmish I ended by calmly staring the device into silence. That desk was built by my father. It moves only when I decide its history has reached a conclusion, I said, my voice as cold and unchanging as the granite peaks outside. He didn't even look up, muttering something about maximizing the floor plan as if he were an artist and not a man who couldn't find his own socks without a GPS. I didn't stop him physically, choosing instead to observe how my daughter, Greer, stood by and watched her husband treat my life's work like unwanted furniture. I've survived corporate takeovers and mountain storms, yet the quiet betrayal of a child's indifference is a unique kind of weight. In my experience, those who talk most about modernizing are usually the ones who haven't contributed a single original thing to the world. I stepped aside as they hauled the desk into the corridor, noting every fresh scratch they left on the polished wood with a ledger-like precision. They took my chair next, laughing about how retro it looked, completely oblivious to the fact that I was already mentally dismantling their comfort. I retreated to the kitchen where Marin was slowly peeling an apple, her knife moving in perfect, silent ribbons that spoke of a very specific kind of focus. The study is gone, I told her, leaning against the counter with a dry smirk that hid the sharpening edge of my resolve. She didn't look up, but the way she placed the knife down told me that Alaric's stay was about to become much more educational than he expected. By midnight, he would discover that his new lounge sat directly above the house's main pressure valve, a mechanism I knew how to make very, very talkative. He wanted a room with a flow, and I was more than happy to provide one that involved a rhythmic, metallic banging through the floorboards all night long. By midday, Alaric had decided that my private wine cellar was actually the communal bar for a dinner party he hadn't bothered to mention. I watched him emerge from the basement clutching a bottle of 1994 Bordeaux, as if it were a cheap soda, his thumb smudging a label that had seen more history than his entire career. I attempted to use the voice command system to lock the cellar door, but the house decided my authoritative growl meant I wanted to hear the weather forecast for Helsinki. It's a specialized kind of irony when the technology you paid for treats you like a stranger in your own hallway. I stood there, watching Greer polish my grandmother's silver with a paper towel, her movements hurried and careless as she prepared for important guests who hadn't been invited by the owners of the house. Some people believe that silence is a sign of surrender, but in this house, it's usually the sound of a fuse burning down toward the powder keg. That wine needs to breathe for 2 hours. Alaric, though I suspect your guests won't know the difference between vintage grapes and fermented vinegar, I said, my voice cutting through his frantic humming like a scalpel. He gave me a patronizing pat on the shoulder, telling me to just relax and enjoy the company, as if I were a guest in a hotel he was managing. I retreated to the kitchen, where I accidentally fought a brief, losing battle with a high-tech espresso pod that exploded with the enthusiasm of a small grenade. I wiped the foam from my hand. My expression remains unchanged, because a true professional never lets a mechanical betrayal ruin his composure. I've spent 60 years learning that you don't need to shout to be the most dangerous person in the room. You just need to know where the light switches are. They were so busy setting the stage for their grand performance that they failed to notice I had already rewritten the script. The first headlights began to sweep across the mountain road, illuminating the arrogance of children who thought they could play house in a lion's den. The guests were arriving with expectations of luxury, but they were about to find out that hospitality is a gift, not a right. I reached for the main breaker in the pantry, wondering how their important associates would enjoy a dinner party held in total, suffocating darkness. Alaric's guests arrived, a pair named Vance and Seneca who looked like they'd been vacuum sealed into their suits. They walked through the foyer as if they were inspecting a museum they already owned, barely acknowledging the man who actually paid for the floors. I attempted to offer a polite nod, but my automatic blinds chose that exact moment to descend with a mechanical whine that sounded suspiciously like a dying cow. "Don't mind him," Alaric chuckled to Vance. gesturing toward me with a wine glass as if I were a slightly malfunctioning piece of furniture. The altitude gets to him sometimes. He's at that age where he gets confused by simple things like remotes and reality. I stood perfectly still, my hand resting on the back of my favorite leather chair, letting the silence grow until it felt heavy enough to choke them. I've lived long enough to know that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the smallest stake in it. Seneca looked at me with a pity that felt like a cold shower, asking if I needed help finding my favorite slippers. I gave her a smile that didn't reach my eyes, the kind of smile that makes people check if their car doors are locked. I find that at my age, I don't lose things. I simply wait for them to realize they're in the wrong place. I replied, my voice steady and low. Alaric rolled his eyes and whispered something about senior stubbornness while leading them toward the dining room I had built with my own savings. He poured my 1994 Bordeaux into cheap plastic tumblers because he didn't want to risk the good crystal around me. I sat at the head of the table, a position they tried to nudge me out of, and watched them discuss flipping this property for a mountain resort. It's a remarkable thing to be treated as invisible in your own home, but invisibility is the ultimate advantage for a man planning a counterstrike. I reached for the salt, accidentally knocking over a decorative candle that extinguished itself with a pathetic puff. A minor tactical error in an otherwise flawless performance of restraint. They think they've already inherited the estate, but they haven't noticed the legal documents I left face down on the side table. Tomorrow morning, their luxury retreat will have a very different set of house rules. I watched Alaric use my grandfather's antique silver tray as a coaster for a soggy pizza box, and for the first time in 60 years, I felt the thin thread of my patience finally snap. It wasn't the pizza that offended me. It was the casual, oily erasure of a legacy he hadn't the spine to build himself. I tried to maintain my stoic mountain patriarch facade, but I ended up getting my sleeve caught on the basement door handle, performing a brief, undignified dance that looked more like a frantic mating ritual than a graceful exit. My pride took a small bruise, but my resolve became a diamond in that moment of absurdity. I've lived through 60 winters, but none felt as biting as the realization that my own daughter looked at me and saw only a vacancy sign for her social climbing. Greer was laughing with Seneca about how they'd paint over the natural cedar walls because wood is so dated, as if they were redecorating a cheap apartment instead of a masterwork. People talk about the wisdom of age, but usually, it's just the accumulation of evidence that you should have stayed single and bought a faster car. I stood in the kitchen, staring at a motion sensor faucet that refused to give me water because I wasn't waving my hands with enough theatrical passion to satisfy its sensors. I'm not broken or confused. I'm just recalibrating my expectations for what a family is supposed to be in the modern age. They think my silence is a slow fading of the mind, a gentle sliding into the fog of the past, where I can be easily managed. In reality, I was calculating the exact cost of the bridge they were currently setting on fire with their arrogance. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a clarifying, surgical coldness that made every breath of mountain air feel like a sharp, clean blade. They've spent the entire evening measuring the rooms for new curtains while I've been measuring the distance between father and stranger. The internal snap wasn't loud. It was the quiet, terrifying click of a bolt sliding into place, locking them out of my heart forever. I saw Marin standing in the darkened pantry, holding a box of Alaric's expensive imported cigars. She didn't say a word, but the way she gripped the cardboard told me that my limit wasn't the only one reached tonight. I stood in the kitchen, watching the reflection of the party in the glass of the oven door, a distorted, flickering view of people I no longer recognized as family. Alaric was holding court in the dining room, his voice a grating saw cutting through the peace I had spent a lifetime building in these mountains. I reached for a jar of gourmet olives, intending to have a silent, dignified snack, but the lid had been tightened as if by a hydraulic press. I wrestled with that small glass cylinder for 3 minutes, my face likely turning the color of a ripe beet, only to realize I was trying to unscrew a lid that clearly said pull to pop. There is no greater teacher of humility than being outsmarted by a piece of tin while your son-in-law plans your financial demise in the next room. I set the jar down with a quiet, controlled click, the sound of my fury finally settling into a cold, manageable shape. I've seen mountain storms that could rip the roof off a barn, but they are nothing compared to the silence of a man who has finally stopped caring about being polite. I walked back into the hallway and saw Greer touching my collection of vintage maps, her fingers tracing the routes, as if she were deciding which ones to sell first. Don't touch those, Greer. You never were very good at finding your way. Even with a map, I said, my voice as flat and sharp as a frozen lake. She flinched, a small crack appearing in her polished city armor, and for a moment, the air in the room felt like it belonged to me again. I didn't stay to watch her recovery. I headed for the stairs, my heart no longer racing but beating with a slow, rhythmic purpose. I am 60, not dead, and I've spent more years studying the property laws of this county than Alaric has spent looking in mirrors. I reached the master bedroom, where Marin was standing by the window, her silhouette against the moonlight looking like a queen preparing for a long-awaited war. I took the heavy brass key from the top of the wardrobe, the one that opened the floor safe they never even suspected existed. It is finished, I whispered, handing her the documents that would turn their mountain dream into a legal nightmare by morning. As I turned to leave, I tripped slightly over my own slippers, a brief reminder that gravity still applies to the righteous. But the smile on my face didn't falter. Tomorrow, the local sheriff, an old friend who owes me a very significant favor, will be coming up the mountain for a very long, very official conversation. Alaric thinks he has the deed, but he has no idea that the document he signed earlier was actually a voluntary surrender of his own assets to this estate.
I stood at the top of the stairs, my hand resting on the banister, watching the chaotic theater below through a veil of absolute, icy calm. Alaric was waving a stolen cigar like a baton, oblivious to the fact that his ashes were falling onto a rug that had witnessed more dignity in a single day than he had in his entire life. I've spent 40 years curating a life of substance, and in one evening, these modern children have treated it like a disposable backdrop for their own mediocrity. My husband, Hollis, had just retreated, and I could still feel the heat of his quiet fury radiating from the papers he'd placed in my hand, a silent baton passed in a relay of justice. I decided to make my entrance, but my attempt at a grand, silent ascent was slightly undermined when the automatic hall lights flickered and then brightly illuminated my struggle to unstick a piece of Alaric's discarded chewing gum from the sole of my slipper. I dealt with the sticky offense with the same surgical detachment I intended to use on our guests, reminding myself that even the most calculated plans can be tripped up by a lack of basic hygiene. When I reached the bottom, I didn't offer a greeting. I simply walked into the dining room and let my gaze settle on Seneca, a look honed by decades of knowing exactly when a storm is necessary. There is a specific kind of silence a mother uses when she is no longer interested in teaching lessons, but has moved straight to issuing verdicts. Seneca froze mid-sentence, her wine glass hovering as she realized that my hospitable smile was merely the edge of a blade catching the light. I hope the mountain air isn't too thin for you, Seneca. It has a way of making people see things that aren't actually theirs, I said, my voice smooth as polished stone. I began tidying the table, moving with a deliberate, rhythmic slowness that forced them to watch every mechanical, precise gesture I made, turning their party into a funeral for their expectations. Alaric tried to break the tension with a comment about retirement being too quiet, but the words withered when he saw me pick up his damp pizza box with a pair of antique silver tongs. I am not a frail woman who needs to be guided to her chair. I am the architect of this family's foundation, and I am currently reviewing the demolition permits. They see a grandmother who knits. I see a circle of arrogant children who have forgotten that I was the one who taught them how to walk, and I can certainly teach them how to leave. As I turned to leave them in their awkward silence, I noticed Vance whispering into his phone in the hallway, his face pale with a sudden, sharp realization. He had finally looked at the decorations in the study, and he was beginning to understand that we weren't just homeowners, but the people who held his entire career in our hands. I watched Alaric preening in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting his silk tie as if he were preparing to be crowned king of the mountain. Hollis tried to slide past him with a plate of crackers, but he accidentally caught his cardigan on the corner of a decorative bust, causing him to pivot in a circle like a confused ballroom dancer. He recovered with a cough of dignified indifference, though I saw him shoot a look of pure, concentrated venom at the inanimate statue once he thought no one was looking. The vanity of the young is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the weight of a truth they were too lazy to research. You seem very attached to that fireplace, Seneca, I noted, watching her lean against the hearth I had hand-scrubbed just this morning. I sat in the wingback chair, my hands folded perfectly in my lap, observing the way they had already begun mentally auctioning off our heritage. What Alaric failed to mention in his grand speech about family expansion was the small detail of the $3 million preservation easement attached to this land. I've spent my life learning that the most important words in a contract are always the ones written in the smallest ink. This villa is a protected historical landmark. They cannot change a single tile or repaint a single wall without a board of directors I happen to chair. I watched the color drain from Vance's face as he scrolled through the public records on his tablet, finally finding the trap he had walked into. My daughter Greer looked at me then, her eyes narrowing as she realized I wasn't just a quiet observer, but the one who had choreographed their disappointment. I didn't feel the need to explain. The sound of Alaric's expensive car being towed from the restricted access zone outside provided all the commentary we needed. He had ignored the no parking signs I put up myself, likely assuming they were merely suggestions for the elderly. As he ran to the window, shouting about his transmission, I felt a wave of clarity that only comes when you realize the enemy is even more foolish than you predicted. The silence that followed his outburst was the most beautiful music I had heard in years. I saw Alaric drop his phone when he saw the name on the second document I had left on the mantel, a name he thought was buried in a vault thousands of miles away. He looked at me, and for the first time, he saw the predator hiding behind the grandmother's smile. The atmosphere in the room turned as brittle as old parchment, the shallow confidence in Alaric's eyes replaced by a frantic, darting panic. I watched him scramble to his feet, nearly tripping over a high-end designer bag that Greer had treated like a sacred relic just an hour ago. Hollis attempted to make a grand, symbolic exit to the balcony to underscore the moment, but he accidentally hit the emergency lock button instead of the handle, causing the heavy shutters to slam down with the finality of a steel trap. He simply stood there with his back to us for a long minute, pretending it was a deliberate move to heighten the drama, though I saw the tips of his ears turn a sheepish shade of pink. I've lived through enough cycles of human greed to know that the loudest claim of ownership is usually the one with the least legal backing. Wisdom is not just knowing where the secrets are buried, it is knowing who bought the shovel and when the warranty expires. Alaric, stop staring at that document as if it will change its mind. The signatures are quite permanent, I said, my voice cutting through his heavy breathing like a winter frost. Seneca tried to step toward me, perhaps to negotiate or beg, but her heel caught on the edge of the rug, causing her to perform a sudden, jerky bow that no one had asked for. I didn't offer a hand to steady her. Instead, I adjusted my glasses, looking at her with the clinical interest of a biologist observing a particularly transparent specimen. These people think the world is built on clicks and appearances, completely forgetting that the ground beneath them is made of stone and old debts. I walked to the sideboard and began to methodically blow out the candles, one by one, plunging the room into a deep, atmospheric shadow. They were silent now, the realization finally sinking in that they weren't the masters of this villa. They were the intruders, and they were very, very late on their rent. I saw Hollis finally get the shutters back up, his expression as sharp and cold as a jagged cliffside. He didn't look at them. He looked at the clock, counting down the seconds until the headlights of the local authorities appeared on the winding road. Alaric reached for the phone to call his lawyer, but he didn't know that the lawyer had been on our payroll since before he even met our daughter. The look on his face when he hears the first ring will be the only payment I need for this miserable evening. Alaric stood in the center of the rug, his chest heaving as if he'd just run a marathon instead of merely realizing he'd lost a game he never should have started. "This is a misunderstanding, Marin," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the locked door that Hollis was now guarding like an iron sentinel. Hollis tried to swipe through the digital evidence on his new tablet to drive the point home, but he accidentally activated the front-facing camera, giving us all a very high-definition view of his confused eyebrows and several chin hairs. He cleared his throat with a sound like grinding gravel, eventually finding the right screen with a scowl that dared anyone to find his technical struggle amusing. The only misunderstanding, Alaric, is that you believed our years made us soft, when they only made us efficient, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but filling every corner of the room. I watched Greer sink into the sofa, the same sofa she'd planned to toss out, now looking like she finally realized the walls of this house were much thicker than her ambitions. Seneca and Vance were huddled by the window, realizing they were no longer associates, but witnesses to a very public and very permanent collapse. The arrogance that had fueled their evening had evaporated, leaving behind the stale smell of desperation and cheap perfume. I've seen many storms break against these mountain peaks, but none quite as satisfying as the look on a bully's face when they realize the victim has been the judge all along. Alaric started to shout about his rights, but Hollis simply raised a single finger, a gesture so sharp it seemed to cut the air out of Alaric's lungs. You have the right to remain silent, though I know how difficult that is for a man who loves his own voice so much, I added, the irony tasting like a fine, dry wine. We stood our ground, two people who had built a kingdom from nothing, facing down the scavengers who thought they could take it for free. Every second that ticked by on the grandfather clock felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of their plans. The confrontation wasn't loud or messy. It was the quiet, steady pressure of two people who knew exactly how the story ended. Alaric reached for the heavy brass door handle, desperate for an escape, but he froze when he heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots on the porch outside. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than any threat I could have spoken. The heavy thud on the porch wasn't just a knock, it was the sound of the world Alaric had carefully constructed beginning to cave in on itself. He looked at the door, then at me, and I saw the frantic calculation in his eyes as he realized his investment had just become a liability. Hollis stood firm by the entrance, attempting to check the perimeter on his tablet, but he accidentally activated the party mode lighting, bathing the tense standoff in a sudden, rhythmic strobe of neon purple and green. He stayed perfectly still, maintaining his grim expression despite the disco lights, proving that true authority isn't bothered by a bit of accidental flair. You thought you were coming here to claim an inheritance, but you've only managed to bring your debts into a house that remembers everything, I said, my voice cutting through the silent, flashing lights. Greer started to cry, not out of regret for her parents, but because she finally understood that her city lifestyle was evaporating with every second the clock ticked. It is a profound tragedy to realize that the child you raised to be strong has only learned how to be expensive. Alaric grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles white, whispering about legal loopholes as if the law were a suggestion rather than a cage. I watched a moth batter itself against the window pane, a small, desperate thing unaware that the glass would never give way to its frantic demands. We weren't just protecting a building, we were burying the last remains of a relationship that had died long before they drove up that mountain road. Everything you brought here is already gone, Alaric, your car, your reputation, and the delusion that you own us, I added, the words feeling like heavy stones dropping into a deep well. The threat of loss wasn't ours to bear. We had lost them years ago, and now we were simply cleaning up the debris they left behind. Alaric lurched toward the floor safe, a desperate glint in his eyes that suggested he was willing to try one last, violent gamble. He didn't see Hollis reach into his pocket for the small, black remote that didn't control the lights, but something much more permanent. Alaric's fingers scrambled over the keypad of the floor safe, his movements jagged and desperate like a cornered animal. Hollis stepped forward, his expression carved from the same granite as the peaks outside, but his thumb slipped on the high-tech remote in a rare moment of mechanical betrayal. Instead of locking the safe, he accidentally summoned the robotic floor cleaner, which hummed to life and promptly began trying to clean Alaric's expensive leather loafers with persistent, rhythmic thumps. The absurdity of the whirring machine didn't break Hollis's composure. He simply stood there with a dry, slightly judgmental brow raised until the silence felt like a physical weight. The code you're punching in was for a life you've already forfeited, Alaric, I said, my voice echoing in the cold marble foyer with the finality of a closing book. I've spent 60 years observing that those who rush to grab what they haven't earned usually end up clutching nothing but dust and regret. Greer tried to reach for my arm, her face a mask of panicked tears, but I stepped back with a surgical precision that left her grasping at shadows. I don't believe in coincidences, only in the inevitable consequences of treating one's parents like obstacles to be managed rather than people to be respected. Hollis finally clicked the correct switch, and the villa's external security shutters slammed shut, sealing us in a fortress where the rules were entirely ours. The flickering blue and red lights of the sheriff's patrol cars began to pulse through the narrow vents, casting a rhythmic, accusing glow on the intruders. Alaric fell to his knees, not from physical pain, but from the sudden, crushing weight of the realization that his leverage had vanished like mountain mist. I watched him, not with pity or malice, but with the dry, academic curiosity of a woman watching a fire finally burn itself out. The transition from honored guest to trespasser happened in a single heartbeat, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard in this house. We are the architects of our own survival, and tonight, the foundation we built held firm while their house of cards finally collapsed. The heavy door groaned on its hinges as the sheriff stepped into the light, but he didn't look at us. He looked straight at Alaric and whispered a name that shouldn't have been known in these mountains. The sheriff led Alaric toward the door, his hand firm on a shoulder that had never carried a single day's worth of honest labor. Hollis stood by the mantel, trying to look like a victorious general, but he accidentally knocked over a small porcelain shepherdess he secretly hated for 30 years. He watched it shatter with a look of profound, hidden satisfaction, then adjusted his posture as if the destruction were a planned part of the evening's cleanup. It was a gift from your mother, Alaric. Much like this house, it was far too fragile for your clumsy hands, I said, my voice as steady as the mountain itself. Greer stood in the doorway, her designer world in ruins, looking at us as if she were seeing two strangers instead of the parents she thought she could outsmart. I didn't feel the need to console her. Some lessons are only learned through the cold, hard lens of consequence. I've spent my life building a home, not a bank, and those who can't tell the difference don't deserve a seat at our table. Hollis finally found the right remote and turned off the ridiculous strobe lights, plunging the room into the soft, dignified glow of the embers in the hearth. He walked over to me, his step sure and his eyes clear, showing no trace of the confusion Alaric had so arrogantly predicted. We watched the taillights of the patrol cars disappear down the winding road, taking the noise and the greed back to the city where it belonged. I've learned that the greatest victory isn't in the fight itself, but in the silence that follows when you realize you are finally alone in your own sanctuary. Hollis reached for his black coffee, his hand perfectly steady, and gave me a small, knowing wink that contained 40 years of shared secrets. We are 60, but in this moment, we are more alive and more dangerous than any of the children who tried to bury us. The mountains are quiet again, and for the first time in years, the air inside this villa is finally clean. We didn't break under the pressure of their entitlement. We simply waited for the storm to pass so we could see the view. They thought we were the past, but we are the foundation, and the foundation doesn't move just because the wind begins to howl.